There is a moment that Jung documented in his patients again and again, and when I describe it, you will either recognize it immediately or you will wonder why no one ever described it to you before. It is the moment when something inside you stops. Not something dramatic, not a breakdown, not a confrontation, not a decision made after careful deliberation. Something quieter than all of those things. A mechanism that has been running continuously, beneath every interaction, beneath every conversation, beneath every choice you have made for as long as you can remember, simply ceases to operate. The mechanism is this: the constant, automatic monitoring of how you are being received. The part of you that tracks, in real time, whether what you just said landed well, whether your reaction was appropriate, whether the expression on your face was the right one for this moment, whether the version of yourself currently on display is being accepted or rejected, whether you are enough in this specific configuration for this specific person or group right now. Most people live inside this monitoring so continuously that they have forgotten it is happening. It has become the background frequency of their existence, so constant, so automatic, so thoroughly woven into the fabric of daily experience that they cannot remember what the interior felt like before the monitoring began. They have mistaken the noise of continuous self-surveillance for the sound of their own mind. And then one day, not because they planned it, not because they finally found enough courage, not because they read the right book or said the right affirmation, the monitoring stops. Or rather, it doesn't stop permanently. It stops mattering. The results come in: approval or disapproval, acceptance or rejection. And the interior does not respond the way it used to. The machinery is still running, but it is no longer connected to the engine. The needle moves, but the car does not accelerate or brake. And in that moment, according to Jung, everything changes. Not eventually, not gradually. In that moment. But here is what no one tells you about that moment. And this is where it gets interesting, because what Jung discovered about this shift, about how it happens and what it costs and what it produces, is almost entirely the opposite of what the popular conversation around approval-seeking suggests. Most people assume that the end of approval-seeking comes from finally feeling good enough, from accumulating enough evidence of your own worth that the need for external validation simply becomes redundant, from getting to a place of sufficient self-confidence that other people's opinions simply stop mattering. This is not what Jung found. What Jung found, and this is the part that changes everything once you understand it, is that the end of approval-seeking almost never comes from confidence. It comes from something that looks, in the moment it arrives, more like collapse than triumph. Hold that thought, because before I can explain what I mean, I have to take you somewhere that most conversations about approval never go. I have to take you to the beginning. You did not begin your life seeking approval. This is crucial to understand. The infant does not seek approval. It expresses. It cries when it needs something. It moves toward pleasure and away from pain with complete, unself-conscious immediacy. It has not yet learned that its expressions can be wrong, that its needs can be excessive, that the version of itself it is presenting might not be the version that keeps the people around it engaged. The seeking of approval is learned, and it is learned very early, in the developmental period that Jung was most interested in, the period before the child develops what he called the persona, the social mask. Here is what happens. The child expresses something: hunger, rage, fear, joy, the full and unfiltered reality of its inner state. And the response it receives from its environment is not neutral. The environment reacts, sometimes warmly, sometimes coldly, sometimes with the particular withdrawal of attention that the child's nervous system interprets as existential danger. Because at that stage, withdrawal of attention is existential danger. A child who cannot maintain the attachment of its caregivers does not survive. And so the child begins to learn. not through conscious deliberation, but through the direct, immediate feedback of a nervous system that is exquisitely sensitive to signals of connection and disconnection. It learns which expressions produce warmth and which produce cold, which aspects of itself are welcome and which are not. And it begins, with a speed and a thoroughness that we consistently underestimate, to organize its self-presentation around what produces the warmth. This is not weakness. This is intelligence. This is the most fundamental form of social learning that a human being undergoes. The problem, and Jung spent his entire career examining this problem, is that the intelligence that served survival in childhood does not necessarily serve authenticity in adulthood. The child who learned to monitor and adjust its self-presentation in order to maintain connection to its caregivers grows into an adult who is still monitoring and adjusting long after the caregivers have changed, long after the original conditions that made the monitoring necessary have dissolved. The mechanism persists. The conditions that created it do not. Now here is the part that most psychology misses entirely, and the part that Jung considered most important. The approval you are seeking as an adult is almost never the approval of the people currently around you. The boss, the partner, the friend group, the social media audience. These are real people, yes. Their responses have real consequences, yes. But the approval you are actually tracking at the deepest level is something older and more specific than any of their opinions. You are tracking the approval of the figures who were present at the original learning. Jung called these figures the parent complexes, internal psychological structures formed in the earliest developmental period that continue to operate as the primary reference points for self-evaluation throughout a person's life. They are not memories of your actual parents. They are internal constructions, partially derived from your actual experience of your caregivers and partially projected, elaborated, and made more absolute by the psychology of childhood. And these internal figures do not update based on new evidence. This is the devastating precision of what Jung observed. The internal critical parent does not hear the promotion you received and revise its assessment. It does not read the positive feedback from your colleagues and recalibrate. It carries its verdict from the earliest period of formation and continues to issue that verdict regardless of what the external evidence suggests. The person who grew up receiving the message that their emotional intensity was too much continues to experience their emotional intensity as something that requires management and justification, long after they have left the environment where that message was delivered. The person who grew up receiving the message that their needs were burdensome continues to feel that their needs are burdensome, regardless of whether any current person in their life has communicated anything of the kind. And so when you seek approval from the people around you, you are not, at the deepest level, actually seeking their approval. You are replaying, with current actors in the original roles, an attempt to finally receive the verdict that the internal parent withheld. An attempt to finally be found acceptable by the structure inside you that was built in the image of the earliest people who decided what acceptable meant. This is why the accumulation of external approval never actually resolves the need for it, because the need was never really about the external people. It was always about the internal structure, and the internal structure does not respond to external evidence in the way the rational mind believes it should. Stop this video right now and write in the comments the name, not the full name, just the first letter, just an initial of the person whose specific approval you have been chasing your entire life without quite realizing it. Not the person you consciously think of as important, the one who shows up in some form in every relationship where you found yourself working hardest to be enough. Just the initial. That's all. Because what you discover in that answer is the actual center of everything this video is about. Now, I want to tell you something about what happens when the approval seeking ends. And I need to be honest with you about what the ending actually looks like. Because if you are expecting liberation and lightness, and a sudden sense of freedom, you are going to be confused by what actually arrives. What arrives first is grief. This is the discovery Jung made again and again in his clinical work, and it is the one that surprises people most. The person who finally, through whatever interior process brings them to this point, begins to release the need for external approval, does not initially feel better. They feel worse. They feel a specific, nameless grief that seems to have no object, a mourning that doesn't know what it is mourning. What it is mourning is this: the hope that underlies all approval seeking, the hope that if you could just find the right configuration, if you could just present yourself correctly enough, if you could just achieve what needed to be achieved and be what needed to be, was eventually going to work, that the internal verdict was going to shift, that the approval was eventually going to arrive in the form that satisfied the deepest need. When the approval seeking ends, that hope ends with it, and the grief that comes is the grief of finally acknowledging something that was always true. The approval you were seeking was never available in the form you were seeking it. The verdict you were trying to change was never going to be changed by external evidence. The mechanism was designed to perpetuate itself, not to satisfy itself. This grief is not comfortable, but Jung considered it necessary. More than necessary, he considered it the gateway. The grief of releasing approval seeking is, in his framework, the beginning of the most significant psychological development a person can undergo. Because on the other side of that, grief is something that cannot be accessed any other way. Jung called it the encounter with the self. Not the ego, the self-concept, the personality, the curated presentation, the self, the deeper organizing center of the psyche, the totality of what a person is, as opposed to what they have been trained to present. The approval-seeking person cannot encounter the self because the mechanism of approval-seeking is specifically designed to keep the self at a distance. The persona, the social mask built to generate approval, operates by managing what is expressed, and what it manages out of expression is precisely the material that the self is composed of. The genuine opinions that might create friction, the authentic reactions that might produce disapproval, the specific, particular, unrepeatable nature of a person that does not fit any generic mold of acceptability. Every piece of yourself you suppress in service of seeking approval is a piece of the self being kept in what Jung called the shadow, the unconscious repository of everything that has been exiled from the conscious self-presentation. And the approval-seeking mechanism, while it operates, keeps that shadow material firmly in place. Because the shadow material, the unmanaged, unfiltered, genuinely authentic reality of what you are, is precisely what you fear will produce the disapproval you are seeking to avoid. So you monitor, you adjust, you manage, and the self remains over years and decades behind the persona, alive, insistent, increasingly pressured, but invisible, until the moment the monitoring stops mattering. Here is what Jung observed about people in whom this shift had genuinely occurred. And I want to be specific about what genuinely means, because there is a version of releasing approval seeking that is not genuine, and it produces very different results. And I am going to tell you exactly how to tell the difference, because this is where most people go wrong. This is the part that the popular conversation about approval seeking never gets to. And if you stay with this video to the end, you will understand something about your own psychology that most people spend their entire lives confused about. The false version of releasing approval seeking looks like this. The person becomes contemptuous. They develop a story about how they no longer care what anyone thinks, delivered with a certainty that requires constant reinforcement. They surround themselves with people who confirm that other people's opinions don't matter. They perform indifference with the same energy they previously performed likability. If you look closely, the mechanism is unchanged. Only the content has switched. Instead of seeking approval for being acceptable, they are seeking approval for not seeking approval. The monitoring is still running. The need for the external verdict is still operating. The internal parent complex is still in charge. Nothing has actually shifted. Jung saw this pattern constantly. He called it the inflation of the ego, the ego's attempt to resolve the pressure of the approval-seeking mechanism, not by genuinely releasing it, but by constructing a new persona around its supposed absence. The persona of the person who doesn't need anyone's approval is still a persona. It is still organized around external reception. It is still, at its core, a performance. How do you recognize this in yourself? By asking a simple question. Does the thought of someone specific disapproving of your current direction produce a visceral reaction you immediately try to suppress? If it does, if there is someone whose opinion still carries that particular weight, that specific interior jolt, then the mechanism is still running, regardless of the story you have constructed around it. This is not a condemnation. It is information. It tells you exactly where the actual work remains to be done. The genuine shift produces a quality that Jung described as the capacity for what he called authentic suffering. Not performance of suffering, not display of difficult emotions for the purpose of eliciting sympathy or demonstrating depth. Genuine suffering, the willingness to experience difficult internal states without immediately organizing them around how they are being perceived. The person who has released approval-seeking can be angry without first calculating whether their anger is justified enough to display. They can be uncertain without performing confidence. They can need something without performing self-sufficiency. They can be moved by something without checking first whether being moved is appropriate in this context. This sounds simple. It is the most radical thing a person can do, because it means that their internal states are no longer primarily organized around external reception. They are organized around internal reality, which means, for the first time, that what is actually happening inside the person is available to the person, not as a performance for an audience, but as information for the self. And this, the capacity to use one's own internal states as information rather than as performance material, is what Jung considered the foundation of genuine individuation, the beginning of becoming, in the deepest sense, oneself. But I promised I would tell you something counterintuitive about this shift, and here it is. The people who undergo this transformation are not, in Jung's observation, the people who found a way to stop caring what others think. That framing, stop caring, be indifferent, develop a thick skin, is a misunderstanding of what actually happens. The people who undergo this transformation almost always become more sensitive to others, not less. More perceptive, not less. More genuinely affected by the people around them, not less. This seems paradoxical, but it makes sense when you understand what the approval-seeking mechanism actually does to perception. The person who is continuously monitoring for approval is not, in fact, paying attention to the people around them. They are paying attention to what the people around them think of them, which is a completely different thing. The person scanning the room for signs of approval is not seeing the people in the room. They are seeing the room through the lens of what it might be reflecting back about them. They are using other people as mirrors rather than encountering them as subjects. When the approval-seeking ends, that mirror function dissolves, and for the first time, the person can actually see the people in the room, can actually hear what is being said, can actually be present to what is happening, rather than to the surveillance of how they are appearing in what is happening. This is what produces the shift in relationship quality that people who undergo this transformation consistently report. Not distance, contact. For the first time, actual contact with actual people, because the layer of self-monitoring that was mediating every previous interaction has been removed. Before I tell you the most important thing, I want to say something about what this shift does to your relationships, because this is the part that no one prepares you for, and it is the part that, if you don't understand it in advance, will genuinely confuse you and may make you doubt whether the shift was worth it. When you stop seeking approval, some of your closest relationships will feel threatened, not because those people are bad people, not because they don't care about you, but because some of your relationships were built specifically on the version of you that sought approval. And that version organized itself around their needs, their comfort, their requirements for what you should be. The person who always managed their emotional expression to keep you comfortable may become less managed. The person who always agreed with you when disagreement was the honest response may start disagreeing. The person who organized their desires around what you approved of may start expressing desires you haven't approved. This will feel to some people who are comfortable with the previous dynamic like loss, like withdrawal, like something has gone wrong. Jung was very clear about this. Genuine individuation, the development of the authentic self, always involves relational friction, not because the individuating person becomes selfish or careless, but because the people around them were, in many cases, in relationship with the persona rather than the self. And as the self begins to emerge, the shape of the relationship must change to accommodate it. Some relationships will make this transition, some will not. And both outcomes, Jung believed, tell you something important about what the relationship was actually built on. There is a last thing I want to say, and it is the most important. The shift does not happen through effort. You cannot decide to stop seeking approval and then execute that decision through willpower. The mechanism is too deep for that. It predates the rational mind that would make the decision. It operates in the nervous system, not in the thought process. Jung's observation was that the shift happens, when it happens, as a result of what he called the individuation process working itself through to a particular threshold, a threshold at which the cost of maintaining the approval seeking becomes higher than the cost of releasing it. This threshold is different for every person. For some, it arrives through a relationship that reaches a breaking point. For some, through a professional failure that reveals how much of their life was organized around others' expectations. For some, through illness or loss, or the particular kind of exhaustion that comes from decades of continuous self-management. For some, it arrives quietly, in the middle of an ordinary moment, with no apparent trigger. The monitoring simply stops producing the urgency it used to produce. The results come in, and something inside says, "I know," and doesn't move. However it arrives, it is not a decision. It is a recognition that the thing you have been seeking was never located where you were looking for it, that the approval you needed was never something that could be given by another person, that the verdict you have been waiting for was always something only you could issue, and that you always had the authority to issue it. You had it before the monitoring began. You had it before you learned what was required. You have it now. If this video landed somewhere real for you, if something in here touched the part of you that has been waiting to stop working so hard to be enough, then write one phrase in the comments right now. Just write, "It was time," because it was time for this. It was time to hear it. And if you know someone who is still in the middle of this, someone who is still working, still performing, still trying to find the configuration that will finally produce the verdict they need, share this video with them. Because the people who need this most are the ones who would never search for it.